The storm caught the Harlan family 4 miles from anywhere that had a name. It had been building since noon, the kind of building that experienced mountain travelers recognize, and that Thomas Harlan, who had not traveled this particular road before and had not expected to be on it in November, had read as ordinary cloud cover until the temperature dropped 8 degrees in 40 minutes, and the wind shifted in a way that left no further ambiguity about what the afternoon intended. He stopped the wagon. The road ahead disappeared into white within 30 yards. The road behind had already done the same. The horses were managing, but managing was the precise word, not pulling with confidence, not moving with the forward momentum of animals that believe in the direction they are heading, but managing in the careful, communicative way that horses manage when they are telling their driver something and waiting to see if the driver is listening. Thomas Harlan was listening. He set the brake and climbed down and walked to where his wife Clara was already pulling the canvas tighter around their 2 children, a girl of 9 named Ruth and a boy of 6 named Eli. And she looked at him with the particular expression of a woman who has agreed to a journey she had reservations about and is not going to say so now because now is not the time. He did not say anything. He looked at the tree line and looked at the road and looked at the sky and calculated what he had. What he had was a wagon with enough food for 2 days if managed carefully, blankets sufficient for a normal cold night, but not for what this was becoming, a canvas cover that would hold wind but not the weight of serious snow accumulation, and 4 hours of light at the most generous estimate. What he did not have was shelter. The dog, a large, rust-colored animal named Barrow that had made the journey from Pennsylvania in the wagon bed and had an opinion about most things, had jumped down when Thomas stopped and had moved immediately off the road toward the tree line, which was not unusual behavior for a dog at a wagon stop. What was unusual was that he did not come back. Thomas called him. Barrow did not return. He called again and heard, in the wind between the trees, the dog moving further from the road rather than toward it, not erratically, not in the chasing pattern of an animal that has found a scent, but in the direct, deliberate way of a dog that has already arrived at a conclusion and is waiting for the slower party to catch up. Thomas looked at the road. He looked at the tree line. He told Clara he was going to see what the dog had found and that he would be back within 10 minutes, and he went into the trees with the lantern. He had not yet discovered what the 10 minutes would contain, but he would not need more than 10. Barrow was sitting at the entrance when Thomas reached him. Not barking, not agitated, sitting with the specific composure of a dog that has been waiting a reasonable amount of time for a conclusion that it considers obvious and is prepared to wait somewhat longer if necessary, but would prefer not to. The entrance was cut into the hillside at the base of a rock outcropping, a timber-framed opening, roughly 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, the frame weathered to the gray of old wood but intact, the lintel stone set with the care of a man who understood that an improperly set lintel would eventually close the passage it was meant to protect. The timbers showed no rot at the surfaces Thomas could reach. They had been treated at some point with something, pine tar, from the smell, and the treatment had held. From the opening, barely perceptible in the movement of the cold air, came warmth. Not dramatic warmth, not the warmth of a fire or a stove, the warmth of something below, the deep, steady, minerally warmth of earth that has stored heat at a depth sufficient to insulate it from the surface temperature, the warmth of a place that the winter had not reached and was not going to reach regardless of what happened above it. Thomas held the lantern into the opening. The shaft descended at a gentle angle, not vertical, not the straight-down shaft of a working mine, but the walking angle of an adit, an exploration tunnel cut horizontally into the hillside by men looking for what the mountain held. The floor was rough stone, dry. The walls were rock, solid. The ceiling was low enough that he would need to duck, but high enough that he would not be crawling. He looked at the warmth coming from below. He looked at Barrow. Barrow had not moved. Thomas went in. The shaft ran for approximately 40 feet before it opened into a chamber, not large, not the cathedral space of a major mine, but sufficient, roughly 20 feet across at its widest point, perhaps 8 feet of clearance at the center where the ceiling domed slightly upward in the natural arch of a rock formation that had been widened rather than entirely cut. The floor was stone, the same dry stone as the shaft. The walls were rock, with the vertical scoring of hand drilling at the near end where the miners had worked, and the natural fracture faces of the mountain at the far end where they had stopped. The air inside the chamber was warmer than the shaft. The shaft was warmer than the surface. The surface was currently in the process of becoming uninhabitable. Thomas stood in the chamber with the lantern raised and turned a slow circle, and completed the calculation that the situation required. The chamber was dry. It was protected on all sides by rock and earth. It was warm in the specific, sustainable way of geothermal mass, not the dramatic warmth of combustion but the steady warmth of the earth itself, the warmth that does not require fuel because it is not consuming fuel but simply releasing, at a controlled rate, the stored temperature of a mountain interior that the winter above had not touched and could not touch. He did not need 10 minutes. He went back through the shaft at a pace that Barrow, following, had to adjust to, and he came out of the tree line and went to the wagon and told Clara what he had found. She asked one question. "Is it safe?" He told her it was safer than the wagon. She began unloading blankets. They moved everything in before the light was fully gone. This was not comfortable work. The shaft required crouching, and the blankets and the food boxes and the children's packs had to be passed through in segments, and the horses could not come in and had to be secured to the largest of the birch trees, with enough rope to let them move, but not enough to let them wander into the storm. And Eli fell twice on the shaft floor and cried the second time, and was carrying the lantern, so the family was briefly in the dark, until Clara produced the candle she kept in her coat pocket from the habit of a woman who has learned that a candle in a coat pocket is a smaller decision than living without light. But they moved everything in. Thomas built a fire at the chamber entrance, not inside the chamber, which would have produced smoke with nowhere to go, but at the base of the shaft where the natural draft of warm air rising past colder air created a draw that pulled the smoke up and out through the entrance rather than back into the living space. This was not a design he had worked out in advance. He had felt the draft on his way back through the shaft, understood what it meant, and acted on what he understood. The fire was small. It did not need to be large. The chamber, once the shaft entrance was blocked against direct wind with the wagon's canvas, and the loose stone Thomas collected from the outcropping face in the first hour, maintained a temperature that the small fire supplemented rather than established. The work was mostly the earth's. Thomas was providing what the earth could not light, and the psychological comfort of a visible flame, which is not a trivial contribution to the well-being of 2 children in a mountain cave in November. Ruth asked if they were going to be all right. Thomas said yes, and meant it in the specific way. A man means something when he has assessed the situation and arrived at a conclusion he can support rather than a conclusion he is performing for the benefit of a frightened child. They were going to be all right. What he did not yet know was for how long. He spent the first night mapping the chamber in his mind, its dimensions, its air movement, its temperature at different distances from the shaft, the quality of the stone at the far end, where the natural formation offered the flattest surfaces, the water seep he had found in the northeast corner that was slow and clean and cold, and represented, if it held through the winter, a water supply that did not require leaving the chamber. The shelter would become more than a place to sleep. It would need to become a system. He did not yet know what the system would look like. He knew what it would require: warmth that was sustainable without consuming their entire wood supply, food that could be extended past the 2 days their wagon held, light that could be managed without burning through their candle stock, and a way to manage the moisture that the seep and their own presence was beginning to introduce into the chamber air. He listed these in the order of urgency. Then he went to sleep. Barrow settled across the entrance to the shaft, like a door that had chosen its own position. The first problem presented itself on the second morning. The fire at the shaft base, which had performed well on the first night, was consuming wood at a rate that Thomas's 2-day fuel assessment could not sustain past the fourth day. The draft that made the fire safe also made it hungry. The same airflow that pulled the smoke out accelerated the combustion in a way that a fire in still air would not have experienced. He needed the fire to produce more heat from less wood. He spent the second morning building a heat shelf. The flat stones at the chamber's far end were the right size and the right material dense, with the thermal mass quality that he had noticed the previous night when he pressed his hand against them, and found them warmer than the air between him and the shaft. He fitted them into a 3-sided enclosure at the base of the shaft. Not a stove, nothing so engineered, but a shaped space that contained the fire's heat on 3 sides and directed it into the chamber rather than allowing it to disperse into the shaft draft. The fire on the second night burned 40% less wood for the same chamber temperature. He noted this the way a man notes something that has moved a calculation in the right direction, without celebration, but with the specific satisfaction of a person whose hypothesis has been confirmed by the evidence and who is now constructing the next hypothesis. Clara had organized the food on the second morning with a precision that came from having done this before, not in a cave, but in the lean years before this journey, the years when what was in the pantry was what there was, and the management of it was the difference between sufficient and not. She portioned it into daily allowances that she kept in a separate sack and did not deviate from, and she supplemented what the wagon had brought with what the mountain offered. Thomas found Rabbit's sign on the third day and had set 3 snares by the fourth, and the first rabbit came in on the 5th. Ruth kept the candle log. This was Thomas's idea, and one of the better ones he had in the first week, giving the 9-year-old the specific responsibility of recording each candle's use in the small notebook from Clara's bag, with the time of lighting and the time of extinguishing, and the remaining length at each entry. The candle log gave Ruth a role, and a role gave Ruth something to manage rather than something to fear, and a child with something to manage is a different child from a child with nothing to do in a cave in November. Eli managed the water collection, the small clay pot that Thomas had fitted under the seep channel on the second day, checking it morning and evening and noting the fill rate, which proved to be reliably consistent regardless of the surface conditions above. The systems were beginning to support one another. By the end of the first week, the wood consumption was manageable, the food was sufficient, the water was reliable, the moisture in the chamber was being addressed by a shallow drainage channel Thomas had cut in the floor on the 4th day, directing the seep water toward the shaft rather than allowing it to pool. And the family had established the daily rhythms that survival requires, and that are, once established, not so different from the daily rhythms of any other form of living. The next problem arrived without warning on the 8th day. The shaft entrance, which had been blocked with the wagon canvas and the loose stone, had allowed a gap to develop overnight where the wind had worked the canvas loose at the lower left corner. The gap was small, 2 inches, perhaps 3, but 2 inches in a November blizzard is not a trivial gap, and the temperature inside the chamber had dropped 4 degrees by the time Thomas found it at first light. He repacked the gap with a combination of the spruce boughs he had cut the previous afternoon for the floor bedding and the river clay he had found in the seep channel sediment, the same sediment he had been clearing from the drainage channel. Mixed with the spruce pitch he had collected from a cut on one of the birch trees, and that had the adhesive quality of a material that frontier builders had used for exactly this purpose for centuries, before Thomas Harlan put it to the same use in a mine shaft on a mountain road in November. The chamber temperature recovered by midday. Sometimes the flaw was hidden inside the solution itself. The drainage channel that had solved the moisture problem had produced the clay that solved the gap problem. The spruce boughs that solved the floor bedding problem produced the pitch that sealed the clay. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was unconnected. Every problem, solved correctly, produced a resource that the next problem could use. He did not say this to anyone in the chamber, but he noticed it. The storm broke on the 10th day. Thomas emerged from the shaft into the specific silence that follows a major storm, the silence of a landscape that has been rearranged and has not yet resumed its ordinary sounds, the silence of 3 feet of new snow and birch trees carrying their white loads, and the particular quality of cold air after days of wind when the wind has stopped, and the stillness feels, by contrast, almost warm. He stood at the entrance and looked at the mountain. The horses had survived. He had gone out on the 4th and 7th days to check them, working through the drifts with the spruce boughs as footing, and had brought them spruce bark and the hay remnant from the wagon and had found them cold but sound. And on the 10th day they were cold and sound still, which was more than he had expected and more than he deserved for a precaution he had not fully thought through. He went back in and told Clara the storm had broken. She asked about the road. He told her he would find out. The settlement of Greer's Crossing was 3 miles down the mountain road, and Thomas reached it on foot in the mid-morning of the 10th day, moving in the tracks the first thaw had begun to open. It was not a large settlement, 11 families, a trading post, a mill that the creek ran when the creek was not frozen. What it was, by the 10th day of the storm, was short. Short on wood in 3 households. Short on food in 2. Short on the specific resource that the trading post had run out of the previous week and had not been resupplied before the storm sealed the road, candles, which is not a dramatic shortage until it is the 8th day of a mountain storm and the children cannot see. Thomas listened to this standing at the trading post counter with his hat in his hand, and the specific expression of a man who has spent 10 days solving problems in a mine shaft and has arrived in a settlement that has several of the same problems in a form he now knows how to address. He told the trading post owner what he had found on the mountain road. He described the chamber dimensions, the seep water, the shaft draft and the fire management, the clay and spruce pitch seal, the heat shelf, the temperature differential between the surface and the chamber floor on the coldest night. The trading post owner listened with the quality of attention of a man who has spent 8 days managing a settlement's resource shortfall and has just been offered a resource he did not know existed. He asked if there was room. Thomas said he would need to measure more carefully. He went back up the mountain. The food would go, some of it. The surplus from the careful rationing Clara had managed across 10 days, the rabbit from the snares, the spruce bark tea that Eli had learned to make from the inner bark on the 7th day when the candle logs showed they were burning through faster than the original estimate. The surplus would go to Greer's Crossing before the road opened and the supply wagons came through. Clara had decided this on the morning of the 9th day when the storm was still running, but the food calculation had resolved favorably enough to make the decision possible. She had not consulted Thomas on the decision. She had told him. He had agreed. The families from Greer's Crossing came up the mountain on the 11th day. 7 of the 11 households made the 3-mile walk in the morning of the first clear day, the ones the trading post owner had identified as having the most immediate need. The wood-short households first, the candle-short families behind them. They came with the practical efficiency of people who have been in a difficult position long enough to have lost patience with dignity and retained only the interest in the solution. Thomas brought them through the shaft in groups of 4. He showed them the heat shelf first because the heat shelf was the thing that the wood-short households needed to understand immediately and could replicate in their own structures if they had access to the right flat stone, which this mountain provided in quantity. He showed them the clay seal at the shaft entrance and explained the spruce pitch and the proportions he had used. He showed them the drainage channel and the seep collection, and the candle log that Ruth produced from her coat pocket, with the seriousness of a 9-year-old who has been told her work matters and has chosen to believe it. A man named Barrow, who ran one of the Woodshort households and who had an engineering background from his years working copper mines in the East, looked at the heat shelf for a long time without speaking. Then he said it was a modified reflecting oven principle applied to a radiant heat problem. Thomas said he had called it a heat shelf. Devereux said that was a better name. He spent the rest of that morning in the chamber asking questions that Thomas answered from the 10 days of observation he had recorded in Ruth's candle log margins. Because the candle log had been the only paper available, and Thomas had used the margins from the 3rd day forward as a general record of temperatures and experiments and solutions, and the problems those solutions had produced, and the solutions those problems had required. The mountains had already delivered their verdict. Not in ceremony, not in apology from anyone at Greer's Crossing for a situation that was not their fault and that the storm had created rather than any human decision. The verdict was delivered in the specific language of 11 families that had needed a warm, dry, water-supplied shelter during a 10-day blizzard on a mountain road, and that had found one, and that had found it because a rust-colored dog named Barrow had jumped down from a wagon on a mountain road in November and had not come back when called. Nothing about it looked magical. Every part looked earned. The road opened on the 14th of December. The Harlan family came down the mountain on the 15th, in the wagon that Thomas had dug out of the 3-foot drift that had buried it to the wheel hubs over the previous month, behind horses that were thinner than they had been in October but sound and willing, with a candle log that had 47 entries and a spruce pitch formula written in the margin of the 23rd entry, and a drainage channel specification written in the margin of the 31st. Ruth kept the notebook. She kept it for the rest of her life. Not as a keepsake, as a reference. The kind of document a person keeps when they understand that what it contains is knowledge that was earned at a cost, and that knowledge earned at a cost should not be lost, because the cost of re-earning it is the same as the cost of earning it the first time. Thomas Harlan had not planned to spend a month in a mine shaft on a mountain road in November. He had not planned the heat shelf, or the clay seal, or the snares, or the drainage channel, or the candle log, or any of the systems that the 10 days had required him to build from the materials the mountain provided and the knowledge the problems demanded. He had planned to reach his destination before the storm. The storm had other plans. What the storm had not planned, and what the mountain had provided, in the specific way that mountains provide things, without sentimentality and without fanfare, and without any interest in whether the people involved were grateful or not, was a shaft cut into a hillside by men who had come looking for ore and had found none, and had left their timber frame and their treated lintel, and their 40 feet of adit and their 20-foot chamber to whatever came next. What had come next was a dog that would not leave the entrance, and a man who was, finally, listening. He was, for the first time since the storm had closed the road above Greer's Crossing, exactly where he had meant to be. Not where he had intended to be in November, not at the destination the wagon had been pointed toward, but placed correctly, in a wagon on a road that led somewhere, with a family that had come through, with a notebook in his daughter's coat pocket and a dog on the seat beside him, and the particular knowledge of a man who has spent a month building systems from what a mountain offered, and has arrived on the other side of the experience understanding something he did not understand before. That the shelter had been there all along. He had only needed to follow the dog.